So she clearly was an example of phenomenologically based. Okay, so then just this last year, David and I decided, okay, the Transformative Phenomenology book came out 10 years ago. What's happened since then? And we looked through the 76 dissertations that had been done over time, came up with the 3 levels, and put together, the writers were all alumni who also wrote about not just their research, but their lives and how phenomenology had affected their lives. And so in looking at this and writing this book, what appeared was what I called in the title of this talk, the 10 Competencies of Phenomenologists. And that was for our provost, Jerry Porter. Jerry, if you watch this video sometime, because our provost, like so many academic administrators, is hounded by accrediting agencies. Many of them want to know, well, what are your students able to do when they get their doctorates? What are their competencies? And so that's the word that we used. But it's really not a thing that it's really more of a quality, 10 qualities of character rather than competencies. And one of our alums who couldn't be here because he had to go to a conference in London, Bart Biegner, but he's been to 1 or 2 SPHS. I have to thank him for helping me put together this visual, and he put together my pictures into a coherent PowerPoint, which I'm unable to do because I don't have that kind of skill. So thank you, Bart, for helping with this. And so I'm going to briefly give examples of what these competencies are. The first one is phenomenologists are able to get to the whatness of an experience. What actually is it? This is very important because if you get the whatness wrong and you're doing practice of any kind, you can have an unfortunate negative effect on what it is you're trying to do. If you're a therapist and you mislabel somebody with a diagnostic label that doesn't really fit them, that is not a good thing. And Jim Marlett, who you see here, he used to be a geologist, and now he's a executive coach. Has a very successful executive coaching practice. He already did it when he came to fielding. He recently moved from to an island outside of Vancouver, but he thoroughly grounded himself in Husserl, Gadamer, Schutz, and other theorists, and he put this into what he actually does in coaching and developed a really wonderful model about it. He calls it phenomenologically based coaching. And so that's an example of somebody who clearly exhibits competency 1. Here's another one with the whatness. Daniel Maxwell, who's standing right there, he now is a professor at the University of Florida, but his study was of animal-human communication. Particularly, he learned how to ride. From being a beginner, a non-rider, he learned how to ride dressage with professionals. And this person is, what is this? This is the actual horse whisperer. I can't remember his actual name. He's riding on his horse. And the guy next to him is Dan's father. But what Dan found was that the horses are actually teachers as well. So his horse, the horse that he learned on, became a participant in the research. And he writes about, and has some films of the actual not verbal, but gestural communication of the horse. if he gave a wrong cue to the horse would refuse to do what it was so he was trying, and it would stamp its foot or shake him. And the trainers, like the horse whisperer, if Dan wasn't if his energy wasn't good, his trainer would say, sorry, you can't go on the horse today. You will upset the horse. If you're carrying anger, you're carrying anxiety, you won't get on the horse. So it was that level of energetic communication that Dan demonstrated. So really getting to what is the horse-human communication like? Competency 2 is one of our students named Susan Shea. She teaches at it's a Buddhist university. She also is the one who developed workshops, maybe 10 years ago already, called Authentic Leadership that people take, and that was her dissertation. But what we found was there's a kind of, in all of phenomenologists, there's an authenticity. I know that word has gotten kind of bad rap in some circles, but there's some, you can't, it's impossible to know one of these phenomenologists that isn't authentic, that doesn't care about what they're doing, isn't with what they're doing, isn't wholly engaged. And an example of that is Michael Wilson, who used phenomenology in a really basic way, very important, well-versed in it. He lives in Surrey, BC, right outside of Vancouver. And because of his work, he was able to actually build to get the resources together to build 2 of these villas for homeless and addicted and other people in need. And they're surrounded by wonderful environmental areas. They have their own gardens. And besides that, within 1 year of living in one of these centers, the people who live there who were homeless or addicted or suffering from some kind of mental illness, they can leave and be on their own because they get training and all of that. And it only costs $8,000 a year per person. And we've discovered that it costs about $50,000 per year for public services to each homeless person in the States. So anyway, this is real, outstanding example of an authentic leader, coming from phenomenology. And the third competency is the flesh. Of course, we study Merleau-Ponty, and we know that our consciousness is embodied. And so therefore, and because of Luann coming to Fielding, who was already a massage therapist, Luann and I together started a somatics course at Fielding and a workshop. And now that's resulted in a deepening of our appreciation for how really important it is to not only be conscious in our minds, but our embodied awareness. And phenomenologists can do this. And there we have an example of, Luann had written an article on that, which is in the contemplative book, Walking the Labyrinth of Embodied Practice, as a way of her getting deeper in touch with her data and her writing. And we also have other works coming out on embodied research and things that are all supporting this. And my novel also is a way of embodying. It's called Flesh and Mind because I often found that when we talk about philosophy as if it were just ideas in the head, it doesn't work because we're passionate about philosophy. We fall in love with philosophies. We live and die around them. we breathe them, and you can't just say they're words in a book. They're embodied, they're flesh. And Michael Barber, when he talked about this novel last year, that I was missing a deeper examination of Merleau-Ponty and Levinas in the novel than I had. I just had a quote from Merleau-Ponty in the beginning. He doesn't show up as a character. I never fell in love with him, so I have trouble writing about him like I did the other guys, Jutes and Wagner and George Herbert Mead and Martin Heidegger. So, but I think it has to do with realizing that our relationships with philosophers, they are flesh relationships. So that's the third competency or quality, that we're in touch with somatics in the flesh. The fourth one is that phenomenologists are collaborative and writers. We write and we write and we rewrite, and through writing we realize things in a deeper way. I don't know how you could be a phenomenologist without writing and rewriting it. Maybe you can, maybe if you talk or you dance or something. But here's one example of Bart Buechner, the dear colleague and friend and alum who helped me put the PowerPoint together. And he put together a book. He's a veteran himself, and he's been working also in helping returning veterans. He's dedicated to it in his life. And his book is a compilation of ways of helping returning veterans, written by other alumni. And he's holding up his book. And this is when we were in Krakow a year ago, August, at the Qualitative Research Conference of the European Association. And I got to give a keynote there about how phenomenology is inherently a contemplative method and very important for all qualitative researchers. And I told them they should all come here to this meeting, but so far they haven't showed up. Anyway, but he also, this you can see me in the background in the mirror taking a picture. Anyway, in the square in Krakow, there's a pump that Bart stood and looked at it a long time as a veteran, because it was put there in memory of a soldier who demonstrated his feelings about things as a soldier, that they put the monument up to him. Okay, so that's the writing and exploring and getting to the deeper meaning, and Bart is a good example of that. Another one is Alice Kitchell. She worked with, I think, Phil Lewin too, was her external, and she studied. She lives in Vermont and studied what made the legislature change, because they voted against same-sex marriage, and then a few years later they got together and just voted again. So that has to do with that same competency for writing and rewriting. Competency 5 is the idea that phenomenologists, they're open to discovering a sense of wonder. There's something about our work. We will discover something that, oh my gosh, this is a wonderful new insight. It happens again and again with phenomenologists. And this is one of the students. She's the one who painted the wild horse drawing that we have on the cover of Transformative Phenomenology, Wanhamachi. And she became more and more the side of the scholar. The artist really became more emergent for her, and now she's a full-time artist. She called herself a scholartist. And she's done exhibits. That's one of her recent paintings. And she also raises her own chickens, raises and loves her own chickens. And so it was transformative for her. I wish she was a professor too, but I think this is what she was meant to be doing, an artist and a farmer. The next one, phenomenologists contribute to the method of phenomenology. They discover, if they thoroughly study Schutz and some of you, and they study Heidegger, but they also find out they have their limits, and when they're working with real problems and new information and new participants, the method doesn't always stretch to where they need to go, and they are able to develop new insights into method. One of them is Lee Noble. She is just retired from a long career working for, I forgot the major corporation she worked for, doing organizational development all over the world. She's from South Africa originally, went through the change there, was working with Nelson Mandela during the change, and she wanted to do her dissertation on phenomenology and Mandela's leadership. What was essence? She was starting with a Husserlian approach and wanted to get what is the essence of Mandela's leadership, having worked with him. And she was going to interview other people she knew who worked with him as a leader. However, she discovered that when she was starting, she did a pilot study and did some of the interviews and discovered she was getting cliches from them, because he's such a popular figure and so much in the media that she kept getting the cliches and wasn't getting any new insights. So she decided and studied Schutz very deeply to work primarily with the documents in the archive, his letters from prison and other of his journal articles. And and she read in Schutz that, I forgot exactly what the technical term is, but the true meaning of something is when the person not only says it, but they mean it. They look at it and they say, yes, I stand by that. That's really what I believe. And I think that's really important, because all too often students will do interviews and they'll take themes out of it, but do they know that the person who they interviewed will really stand behind what they said in that interview? All too often they couldn't be sure of it. So what she did was she constructed imaginary dialogues that she had with Mandela, asking him the questions that she wanted to ask him. And that's a major part of her dissertation, her question and what he said. And everything he said comes from, he was only allowed to write one letter a month. Well, I think he was in prison 25 years. Well, that's still a lot of letters. But he said that he had to think hard and be sure that in those short letters he said the most important things that he wanted to say. And she pulled that out into these imaginary dialogues. And this first one attests to that. She asked him imaginatively, was there any positive thing that came from your years in prison? What key insights would you share? Mandela says, it is never my custom to use words lightly. If 27 years in prison have done anything to us, it was to use the silence of solitude to make us understand how precious words are and how real speech has impact. And so on. What would you do if you got stuck? What would motivate you to move forward? Excuse me. Some other examples. I'm going to let you read those because my voice is starting to give out. Another example of competency 6 or quality 6 Phenomenologists contribute to method, like Lee Noble did with imaginary dialogues. Amin Gohal did a dissertation on green women farmers in the DC area. And she used a Schutzian life world perspective. She got to know them well, visited their farms, used Schutz's categories to discuss it. And these are some of Schutz's categories, but she found that she added one to it called rituals and practices, because all of the women had some kind of somatic, contemplative practice that sustained them. The women green farmers have a really hard time financially. They don't get subsidized like the big agri-farmers get, and they have trouble affording land. They have trouble competing in the market to sell their products. So they're very stressed, but they're very committed. And they use these rituals and practices to sustain their work. Competency 7, phenomenologists understand that life worlds are constructed in communication. And one example is Evie Beck, who is here this morning with her work on dancing in a wheelchair. And here she is at an international conference. She presented a paper in Krakow on this work called Dance's Epistemology, Embodied Knowledge and Social Change. And she's very well grounded in Schutz and phenomenology. Another example is Dorianne Cotter-Lockard. You see her playing the violin. And she graduated from Juilliard as a violinist, played as a classical violinist, and then she went and got an MBA and worked for a Fortune 500 company. And then she came to fielding and wanted to bring it together in a new way. So she studied how the Cleveland Conservatory trains their string quartets, and came up with ideas that she then takes into consulting on the communication and teaching of better communication that is beyond the purely verbal. And actually, that now the teachers, the professors at the Cleveland School put together her ideas into a book of how to teach musicians. So the phenomenological insights have fed back because the teachers would do these techniques, but they just did them. They didn't have the second order construct that this is a meaningful way to do it. So that became the book that they use in teaching the students. Another one is the 8th competency, is the connection with foundational thinkers. I think it's really important that our connection is deep and rich with our foundational thinkers. And I know you all know that, but out there in the practice world, practitioners are often taught that you just need these ideas and these techniques. You don't even need to know where they came from. But I think that phenomenologists benefit from getting that deep connection. One of them is Lori Schneider. She's been to several SPHS meetings. I forgot who her external was. It was somebody from here. Anyway, she also really got deeply connected with Heideggerian thinking because her topic was, what is the sense of place and environment for the home office worker? And of course, Heidegger and place are Heidegger's very important on that issue. So she read him in depth and ended up a whole chapter in her dissertation about Heidegger and place and how he was sort of a companion of hers through the years of working on this. And it also affected her life. Here she is in her home office. And then she evolved after that. She became a runner and running races. And that was in part, she gave a paper at SPHS on running as a way of overcoming grief, because her husband had died, and she overcame grief by running and did a phenomenological study of it. And this is a recent picture. She is now living with her boyfriend, who's an architect, and she got him into Heideggerian architecture, and they started brewing beer in their home and redesigned their house so it's partially a brewery. Well, she didn't end up as a professor, but she ended up in a pretty good place as a phenomenologist. Said to say hi to you. She wished she could be here, but she's at a brewery convention. So, okay, competency 8. We're still on the foundational thinkers. Here's Joanne Clark, who studied in Calgary. She's in Calgary and studied women green entrepreneurs in Calgary using shoes, very grounded in shoes. And this is her drawing of the puppets that she came up with, or that she'd see in homunculi, from studying maybe a dozen of the women green entrepreneurs. Miss I intentional, Miss A I green, and Miss caring relationship. I thought that was a really neat way to show that she'd see in puppets. And then my friend Bart put the other puppets in there. So, and competency 9 is that phenomenologists work from the epoche, and they are able to do this. They are able to get to the place of putting that all aside. Chris Mayer practiced meditation for a long time, but built it into his dissertation. And his dissertation was on working from the epoche that he used meditation to reach, then walking around on a landscape, and after walking around on a landscape in that epoche, then designing what the landscape should be like, so that the people who lived in it, so that it would enhance their consciousness. So that was his dissertation. And he put a detailed parallel in his dissertation between the qualities in the epoche and the way he practiced his yogic meditations. So that's Chris. Okay, competency 10, transcendence in lived experience. And the contemplative movement, I think, is an example of that in the book that we did. I'm not quite sure why we put this slide in here, but what I contend is that there's a deep similarity between phenomenology and Vedantic Hinduism in the way they look at the nature of the world, and what is called Brahman in Vedantic thinking is very congruent with aspects of phenomenology. I wrote about this in the chapter in this book, and I ran it past several swamis who say, yeah, you got it. So I feel pretty good about it. Okay. The thing is, at the same time I was working on this paper, which is very optimistic about human consciousness, if we all could be trained as phenomenologists, we would have a much better world. But I also am aware of the dangers the world is in. And I got a quote from Bertrand Russell about that I wanted to read. Men fear thought as they fear nothing else on earth. And here we are trying to get people to think deeper and more critically all the time. More than ruin, even more than death, thought looks into the pit of hell and is not afraid. It sees man a feeble speck surrounded by unfathomable depths of silence. Yet it bears itself proudly, as unmoved as if it were Lord of the universe. Thought is great and swift and free, the light of the world and the chief glory of man. Bertrand Russell. However, he was very pessimistic about our ability to do this, our ability to make this transformation in time. And we are hoping that more and more people will become phenomenologists so we can all help the transition we need. The earth is telling us that we can't go on the way we are. Our consciousness has to evolve. So we have this concentration and building called somatics, phenomenology, and communicative leadership, where we're trying to move forward in this kind of education. Okay, thank you.
Valerie, will you take questions? There's water there for you.
Yeah, we have until about 5 minutes or so. Happy to answer questions.
Because I'm moderating. Questions? I will start with a question then, because there's a method behind the methodology. So for your students, for their dissertations you've worked with that are phenomenologically based, that you think are the purest, are you suggesting that there's not a literature review in a conventional sense? Because to what extent does going into the literature first contribute to prejudgment?
Oh, well, I think it's very important that the students read the great thinkers, and they can't really feel solid in what they're doing without reading them. A good example of that is in our book, Transformative Phenomenology. The first chapter was written, the second chapter, by Sandra Simpson, and she came many of these meetings way back. She died a few years ago. But anyway, her chapter is on becoming a phenomenologist as a form of deep transformation. And in her chapter, she describes how reading Schutz, how reading Husserl and others deeply affected her and transformed her. And then she ended up teaching a phenomenology course at the U of Florida. So I think reading the thinkers is really important.
But what about reading the content? Say Dorian Cotter-Locker works with musicians. What about reading about musical theory or the construction of music?
Yeah, of course. Phenomenologists would want to do that. They would want to know whatever they can, whatever is already there. I don't think Dorian Cotter-Locker could have done that dissertation on the phenomenology of musicianship were she not also a violinist. So.
Other questions?
I knew that you were interested in Mead, but what could you say about Mead's thought that's helpful for you in phenomenology?
Well, I think he's still really important because he offers a profound explanation for how we develop a sense of who we are through communication. And his concept of the I and the me as parts of the self. The me is what other people think of us and what they attribute to us, and the I is how we go back. But then he also talked about, I think it's in one of his essays, the reflective intelligence, and how the internal thinking process is crucial. So Mead is real basic. I have an article I published on Mead and Heidegger comparing Dasein with the self. And in that article, Heidegger comes out way ahead, but still, Mead's important. And I think Schutz recognized that too. He was engaged with Mead. I know the other day you mentioned that you like coulis a lot better than mead, and maybe I didn't
Not
hear.
better, just
Not better, but in that point.
I have a question related to the transformative phenomenology, and specifically the transformation process would be really interesting for me. How is this kind of process like actually taking place? Because you were mentioning several different possibilities, but how are we as individuals being transformed? Or how is the transformation process being taking place?
Well, it takes place through writing about your own experiences in a very deep way. Someone described that earlier today, some of the protocols that she wrote. Oh, it was Lorraine. No, I forgot who it was. Anyway, writing and rewriting, using bracketing, using imaginative variations, because that deepens your self-understanding of what it is that you're interested in and why, and where it comes from in you. And but not just writing by yourself, writing collaboratively. So we share those writings on a computer, on a forum. And so the protocols that students write, they read each other's and comment on them. So I think that deepens it, because others will read the protocol and see in it things that you didn't see. So it's a very collaborative process, writing and sharing about things, phenomena of your experience that you really care about. Another part of it is bringing in the body, and that's why we also have a course on somatics that Luann and I designed. Because there the people like, who's the guy who wrote the book Somatics?
Thomas Hanna.
Yeah, a psychologist around in the 1970s something rediscovered the importance of learning through the body. Jenlin's focusing is another example of it. And that's very congruent because it's another form of knowing from within. And so much of what we teach is everything you learn is out there and you take it in. What phenomenology asks us to do is learn everything from within and be with from within your phenomena and your life world. And then it's kind of Weberian in a way too, about sympathetic understanding, or he didn't use that word, but we can understand what the other is like because we have a similar experience. Maybe phenomenology takes that to a deeper level. So those are several things. We have a somatics workshop where we spend 2.5 days doing Kundalini yoga, which I teach. And what we do with that is we're able to connect the energy centers in our own bodies with what our understandings are and with our relationships. And we include some of the dance, somatic dance. I forgot to mention another student, Jason Giuffrian. His work is he leads men's retreats in Colorado for men who feel like they have lost their grounding or never got a grounding in their identity, because so many have trauma or relationships with fathers who are absent or in some way abusive or other problems. And he brings them together and he uses somatic dance and other methods. He wrote a dissertation about that. But his main philosophical basis was Merleau-Ponty. And so by connecting the deep insights of our phenomenology's thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, Michael Barber, and others here, we then can deepen our own self-understanding, and this changes us. And I think it's very important that we do it together. It's very hard to do that on your own. But if you support each other, then you become a just better person. And not, wait, erase that, that's a cliche, you become a better person. But phenomenologists have those qualities. And just imagine if everybody in the world had those qualities. I think we should start teaching them in preschool. And then we'd have a hope for a better world. I don't know if that really answered the question.
I just was reading some of the work of your students. I think they do things like, if you study phenomenology, suddenly it's not just they start doing that. They start practicing phenomenology when they're doing things like coaching. That guy that does the coaching for people is a business coach. Well, he's noticing things and having interpretive experiences, and talks about the overlapping that Gadamer's fusion of horizons. So the concept becomes sort of embodied in what they're doing when they're studying, and just approaching people. So it's sort of, they become phenomenologists in a way. It's just deeply part of who they are, which I think is nice.
You know what I think it is too, because I work with an older group of students as well. Similar to what Valerie does, our average student is 42 years old. She's a woman. She's probably a practicing psychotherapist, comes to us for a doctorate. They're already versed in things when they come in. So these are mature people who have life experiences, and I believe in andragogy too, so you take that into consideration, that you're dealing with an adult learner. What I find is that so many come in without the critical thinking skills that are necessary to write a dissertation and to be a phenomenologist. I see the same sort of transformation in other in-depth methodologies, because I also teach a narrative inquiry, and the complete suspension of assumptions in your work turns back, and it happened to me on my life. So I started questioning, as you said, everything around me in the same sort of way. You can't confine it. You can't just tunnel vision it and say, I'm just going to do this with my research. Because then you start looking at your marriage, your children, your parenthood, your where you live. Everything becomes exposed to that way of questioning and cutting away assumptions. And if you come to it with honesty, and if you don't, as Charlie Seashore used to say, it's just a very expensive intervention in midlife. Lorraine, you have a
Yes,
question?
and I feel like what I call the silver age of phenomenology, we were fortunate to have happen at Fielding, because we had those 25 years of working with those 76 doctoral students. And how many places have that opportunity? I will be retiring one of these years, and I don't know if phenomenology will still be taught at Fielding, if this will continue. So maybe it's, the silver age will then some other place it may happen. So anyway, let's try to keep it going.
Lorraine, you had a question? Other questions?
Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity, being here, sharing this with you. Thank you.